Hello, and thank you for having a listen to this week's episode of Secure Insights with NDK Cyber. Now, as many of you do know, NDK Cyber is first and foremost a recruitment company that specializes in placing cybersecurity talent around the world, from security vendors, industry, consulting, and everything in between, from your junior roles right through to your leadership and all the weird and wonderful quirks that come along the way. Now, the NDK Secure Insights series is all about shining a light on certain areas of cybersecurity that are growing, need to be talked about, are being talked about. So we have guests from all walks of life. This week we are joined by Victor Atkins. Victor is somebody who spent a long time in the US intelligence community before spending a number of years with the Department of Energy, and now joined the consulting realm as a real consultant in the OT cybersecurity space. And in this week's episode we really delve into many different areas. I think the key points here for me are the latest revelations on where China is when it comes to the US industrial control systems and an OT security landscape. We also touch on the state of OT security generally, skill shortage and things like that as well. So really looking forward to your thoughts on this one. I hope you enjoy, and we'll speak soon. Victor, thanks for jumping on the pod. I know you're very busy, so welcome.
Hey, thanks, James. I'm happy to be here.
So I guess for those that don't know you, are you okay to give a brief overview of your background and experience, and we can jump into some things from there?
Yeah, no problem. So I'm currently Director of Executive Advisory Services at 1898 and Co., which is part of Burns& McDonnell, a very large engineering, procurement, and construction firm here in the United States that builds a lot of infrastructure within the critical infrastructure space across all sectors. I basically lead consulting with some of our customers on how to reduce cyber risk in their environment, particularly in industrial environments. So technology, engineering solutions, training and awareness, sometimes just board engagement, anything that they need really to try to advance their OT cybersecurity programs. Prior to coming here, which was just over a year ago, I spent about 20 years in the US government in various national security roles, intelligence community roles. And my last position at the Department of Energy was running their cyber intelligence program. So we basically were charged with assessing foreign nation state level threats like China and Russia. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Threats to the power grid and how they might be able to take us down in the control environment specifically. So I, led a team that not only pushed information to the sector in terms of threats, but also supported policy in the U.S. government on how we might counteract that. And also just I'm a generalist. My educational background is in philosophy. It's not in cyber or any technical issues. We can talk about that on workforce issues, but you won't find a single cyber credential next to my name, James. So I hope I still qualify as credible for your audience.
I think given some of the points you dropped in there, I think we tick the credibility box, should we say?
Great.
So with all this in mind then, I think let's get a place to start. Your overview, or I guess maybe your take on the state of OT security at the moment, early 2024, what are we looking at right now?
Yeah, I think that we're coming out of a hard year. There's a lot of companies were contracting, and some firms in OT security were actually laying people off because I think that with interest rates being high and other just market factors, it was tight in the market. I think for cybersecurity, but I hope and I expect that that's going to turn around here in 2024, possibly driven by some of the threats we'll talk about. But I think in the obvious sense, companies are rapidly transforming their operational technology networks to include more automation and digital assets for control and monitoring. And executives are also learning. We hear a lot about they want data-driven decision making. So all of that data that used to be just kind of like not no one saw much value in it is now being mined to make real-time business decisions or to support long-term planning. So that OT data is getting pulled and analyzed. So I think there's a lot more connectivity into those systems. Here at 1898 and Co., we get asked a lot from industry to consult on building roadmaps and strategies for this IT OT integration that is necessary to support all of these trends. And they're overhauling their OT networks pretty rapidly to do things like in the power sector to accommodate renewables, for instance, which is going to incorporate a lot of digital assets to manage the grid. But in my view, just in terms of all of these trends, I think that the desire to reap all these benefits is far outpacing any discussions about security and risk that's being introduced by all of these trends. And so, for instance, even in those road mapping efforts, the security bucket of the whole roadmap is a small chunk of what people want to talk about. This security is just a place that organizations don't want to spend a lot of money because they have to spend a lot of money on integration and introduction of new technology, right? It's you got to make those trade-offs. I think this is a dangerous trend if we're going to be talking about trends in the market, because if they only focus on the upside, those downside risks that they either don't address or don't worry about will just accumulate over time. And so that when a bad day happens, whether that's an attack or because the system is so complex that something fails and nobody really knows how to get it back online quickly, depending upon the magnitude of the event, it could be catastrophic to an organization. And then all those upside benefits just get washed away in a single moment, you know. So I think that folks need to think about that. My only advice to people in your audience here is to just keep fighting the good fight. I mean, I unfortunately humans, we don't like learn. We don't learn. We kind of learn the hard way, I guess. So, you know, there's that old saying, it's only obvious after it happens. Everything's obvious after it happens. And so I think if we continue on that way and we only are going to learn to take security more seriously after an event, then I think in the meantime everybody in this field needs to just continue to do the work. They just need to continue to engage their customers and their clients and try to make the improvements that they can make, so that, you know, either we can avoid those days, or, you know, they're less impactful if they do happen.
So even in today's world, and you point out to it there, it's only obvious after it happens. But 10 years ago, say, when
Mhm.
cybersecurity as a whole wasn't too hot on everybody's agenda, there was a lot of decisions made by the business to get more data, to scale up quicker. It sounds like we're falling into the same trap again a little bit on the OT front.
Yeah, I think that, you know, again, when I first got into the business on the intelligence side and we were looking at operational technology threats and we were asking to get sample data from OT networks to see if we could do some anomaly detection or anything like that, most organizations couldn't even pull it because they didn't monitor. I mean, there was a lot of attitude about, well, it's separated, it's not really valuable. Our We're mostly using IT business data kind of things. But I think it's just changing. You know, you look in critical infrastructure sectors. I've talked to people, water, power, critical manufacturing. They see data in the OT environment that could help them make quicker responses if there's, you know, or anticipate outages, or, you know, there's a lot of things that they see now. They're like, oh, that is valuable. Let's mine it. We have to then puncture into the OT environment to pull that data out and put it in places like the cloud or other places. And so now that data is accessible. The networks that the data comes from are now accessible from outside, you know, in the IT world or things. And so as all of this is happening, the security features that operate in an OT environment are not the same as an IT environment. I mean, your audience will know that. And so I think the trends are, yes, pull the data, use the data, access the data, but then how are we actually securing those linkages? Are we making smart decisions about how those are architected? Are we addressing potential downside risks in doing those things? And in doing those, if are those risks, you know, are those measures to accommodate the risk also going to support the business decision? There's a lot of questions that need to get answered there. And I think that people are still just kind of on the early days of asking and answering those questions.
Yeah, indeed. That's a really common theme from the amount of people we speak to, not just on this podcast platform here, but those on a day-to-day basis. That seems to track with other views too. So we'll come on to that later, but I really wanted to dig into the point you mentioned in your introduction there, China and Russia.
Yeah.
Let's tackle
Yes.
China first.
Let's talk about China first. So it's funny when I am engaging in security venues, you know, I'm always like, well, secure from what? What are you securing against?
Mm.
Right. How are you going to build a security appliance or a platform unless you really know what you're up against? And I'm kind of surprised. I shouldn't be, but I'm kind of surprised. You know, I go to conferences. I have a lot of discussions with people about how little they're aware of what's happening. So if your audience learns from this, that's if they get nothing out of this, then I think this is really a great point, this section here. So let's go from a big picture. Since at least 2019, the US intelligence community has been publicizing analysis and reports. You know, every year the Director of National Intelligence does a worldwide threat assessment that's unclassified. They have been talking about the China cyber threat to U.S. critical infrastructure. They specifically talked about oil and natural gas and others, you know, some other rail sectors and others. It's very special for the government to do this because if they're saying this, then they are pulling this from, you know, sources and methods that are very sensitive. So for them to say things like this and take the risk of putting those sources and methods at risk of possibly being discovered, it means that they think that that information is very valuable for people to know.
Mm.
And again, that drumbeat for the China threat has been going on since at least 2019. Just this last week, so at the end of January, the FBI director, Chris Wray, was on the U.S. Capitol and was given an unclassified briefing, and he specifically addressed this threat from China as ramping up to do extensive hacking operations in the United States, the power grid, oil pipelines, water systems, and all of this in the potential run up to a conflict with China over anything in the region. So you can imagine like a conflict over Taiwan seems to be what people think about the most. And some of the things he said were very provocative. Like I think the quote is that China's prepared to, quote, wreak havoc and cause real world harm to American citizens at a time of their choosing, which is, again, not if the FBI director is out saying something like that, I think he's really, trying to get people to take seriously that they are pervasively in our networks now and prepared to do us harm. Their goals are clear. They want to sow dissent within the American population, confuse us, sap our will to support a warfighting effort in the Pacific, and even at the logistical level, just prevent by shutting down systems like a port or power systems that are around military bases, for instance, that would prevent the U.S. military from providing logistical support to regional partners and allies in the event of a conflict. So China has very good reason to do this. They've been preparing it for a long time. And now I think if you're hearing the FBI director coming out and saying that they're prepared to wreak havoc now, I think that what we have to accept is that they are there and have a sufficient foothold in the system to be able to have an effect at a time of their choosing, not just, prepare to do so. We can talk about the tactics and the techniques of these groups. So the group is the US government and others call it Volt Typhoon. And so that group, it does a lot of things. It's penetrated these environments and taken advantage of a lot of that connectivity we talked about earlier. So a lot of these systems are building in IT and OT integration and functionality for all these efficiencies. But every one of those network connections and every one of those digital assets that a company wants to use for control, monitoring, and safety can also potentially be hijacked by an adversary to take away that control, eliminate those safety features, and allow you to not view your own environment because they've taken over access. So they're capitalizing on all this functionality. I think there's a couple things to take away here, and the fact that I some of the things I say in my work to constantly build off of these things are just a couple things at a high level.
Yeah, yeah.
First, anybody could be a target.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of companies and industry, small rural electric co-ops, for instance, or water munis or something, maybe people in remote areas who think, well, I'm not a target of this. What do I have to worry about it? And I think that that's a kind of a dangerous assumption to make because there's an old saying in the threat world where the adversary gets a vote. They get to decide who they want to target, and you may have an asset in your or a capability underneath your service area that they think is important, and you may not think it's important, but they do. And so if they want to attack, they could potentially attack anybody in a critical infrastructure environment. I think that everybody should assume that they're not below the contempt of the adversary, even if they're not the target. There are lots of scenarios in which, because of all this connectivity, or you may have digital assets in your environment that are very similar to one in another targeted environment, you could be collateral damage because in attacking, say, a large power system, you could, as a connected resource, whether you're a vendor or a partner organization, that could spill over into your networks and take you down as well. There are other scenarios in which maybe if you're a small company, like in a power utility that has limited IT resources, you could be the target to pivot into through trusted networks into a larger environment that they really want to attack. So you're just the access point to get into the larger organization through trusted links or other connections. And so there's a lot of ways in which this could happen. And I just think that people need to recognize that they're part of a target ecosystem now, and that anybody could really be affected by this.
Yeah.
And I also think that OT security is not about keeping people out anymore. Cybersecurity kind of has an ethos of like our job is to protect the endpoints and keep adversaries out of the system. And if there's anything you can take away from Director Ray's comments, I think it's that they're already in. And so keeping them out isn't the mission anymore. What the mission is now, how do we survive? How do we survive an attack if they're already in? So which is more about questions of resiliency and trying to limit damage and regain functions if you have a disruption? Those are different questions than your kind of typical cybersecurity questions. I mean, we just came out of a pandemic. It's very similar in the mindset. The mindset was not never get COVID. That would be a ridiculous goal given the nature of pandemics. But the goal was survive COVID. You know, if you actually get it, have you taken the health measures like vaccines and other medications or whatever to be able to survive getting the disease? The same thing here. If you have them in your system already, how do you survive an attack? I think that are questions that organizations in the OT space really need to start thinking about. And there's all kinds of engineering solutions and process and training and all these things that you can do, but you do things differently if you're asking those questions. And then finally, I think it's just engaging operators and engineers and security experts at the level of the process control itself and say, okay, so this is below executives. This is really at the level where the rubber meets the road in a facility or in a substation or a control center, is to say, take on the adversary mindset for a minute. Pretend you're the bad guy. You know, how would you break your own system? And these people know, you know, they sometimes sit around and think about it themselves. And so, you know, not to do malicious things, but they think about, they know
Mm.
how they break their system. And that's the greatest place to start because then you can get in a conversation around, well, like, how do we harden that area? You know, how do we make that area less accessible or more hardened from a security control perspective so that you can actually make it more difficult, if not impossible, for an adversary to remotely access
Mm.
that
So
area.
it's
So
almost creating a like a security-minded culture from top to
yeah,
bottom to
yeah,
enable everybody to get on the same. We're all wearing the same jersey here.
yeah, exactly. So because I think again, this kind of goes back to that mentality of if you're a target, if they're already in your system, then assume the worst, and then let's back engineer out a less risky threat profile there.
Mm.
But if you don't kind of take those two assumptions seriously, then you kind of have no reason to implement a lot of security controls, which may degrade your efficiency a little bit, or may make it more difficult for your workforce to access their systems and do their job. They're not going to see the point, you know. So much of implementing cybersecurity, and I think we'll get into people, process, and technology at some point here, but so much of implementing these changes is cultural. It's just getting people to take it seriously. I hear this all the time in terms of like trying to, make cybersecurity and industrial cybersecurity in particular the same level as safety. I work for a critical infrastructure construction and engineering company. And one of our core principles at Burns and McDonnell is safety first. And it's just like embedded into everything. We don't even have a meeting in this company without a safety moment where people go through and talk about, safety issues. It's just so embedded into the ethos of how people do their jobs. And I think that's pretty common across critical construction firms and places where you actually have, dangerous environments where people can get hurt. So how do you then in the industrial cybersecurity space make that kind of ethos stick with people
Mm.
so that it's not just about protecting your password or not clicking on spear phishing. It's more about you will look at your system or your process or your job function and think just like you do about safety about how this could be compromised or your behaviors that may affect the system, and then you just take those daily steps.
Mm.
I think that, or you ask the questions in the meetings about new designs, or you ask questions about functionality that somebody's proposing, and you say, okay, that all sounds great, but what are the risks that this is adding? And
Mm.
you actually have a risk conversation at the time of the early design phase so that you can actually address them as you go through. Right now, I don't think those questions ever get asked, or if they do, they don't get asked until way late in the process of implementation. So I think that is kind of a cultural ethos that companies need to take on more seriously.
Understood. And I think, to be honest, even taking that China example there, that I don't
Mm.
think is publicized enough. I may be wrong, and I could be looking in the wrong places or not have the right feed set up. But it's not something you hear about regularly. Maybe until last week. But it's
Yeah.
the piece of you hear about the nation states corrupting maybe economically or politically and things like that.
Mhm.
But I think the point that the FBI director was making there, like you say, this is now real world. These are things that we can see and will do damage. And it's not
Yeah.
even like ransomware and attacking our banks,
Mhm.
for example. That's bad. That's not good. But when it's like human lives
Yeah.
directly, it's just another level of, I don't know whether fear mongering is the word here, but it's needs to be drawn awareness to.
Yeah. Well, so in America specifically, we are not used to this concept of having our population be part of the geopolitical situation. Typical wars have been fought somewhere else. The homeland seems to be generally insulated from these kind of issues. And so just I think culturally we struggle with this idea, or we just are ignorant to this idea that we could be the target as well at the population level. I mean, militaries forever have been thinking about ways to, affect populations to degrade their support to their government's effort to fight a war. But I think it's still a kind of relatively new concept here. I think that's just my own opinion about the historical context. Maybe that's why it's hard for us.
Mm,
But also, again, you hit on it, cyber has traditionally been about espionage or stealing information or maybe ransomware, a way to get money from people, which doesn't seem to have the same stakes as, you know, removing an entire city's water supply for
mm.
days or weeks, which could really cause a lot of human suffering, or attacking a power system that provides, or oil and natural gas system that provides electricity and heat to a region under when it's winter, or something like that. That could cause a lot of human suffering. And it's not fair. I mean, it's not fair that these companies that own critical infrastructure are now targeted by nation state adversaries that are well resourced. I mean, in the case of Volt Typhoon, I don't know the number, but I have to assume that there's thousands of people in China right now in the military who whose only purpose is to attack U.S. critical infrastructure via cyber. That's all they do every day. They're well resourced. They're supported by authorities in the government. In fact, our government, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, and the intelligence community have posted unclassified threat bulletins that talk about the legal authorities that China has. Cybersecurity laws, for instance, here's one that many people aren't aware of. There's a law in China that says if you find a vulnerability in your product, source code or whatever, cyber vulnerability,
Mm.
whether you're a US company, foreign company, anything, if you're doing business in China, you are compelled to provide the information about that vulnerability to the Chinese government before you notify anybody else, including your own country. And then, of course, that
Wow.
information is shared with the Chinese military so that that's directly supporting a group like Volt Typhoon. Okay.
Mm.
So
That's scary.
that is scary, right?
Mm.
But I don't have to have a top secret clearance to tell you that. There's information out there that's being posted by the U.S. government that people are just unaware exists. I'm guilty of this. When I was at Department of Energy, again, I said part of my mission was to take information about threats, find a way to distill it down into an unclassified, publicly available format, and then use the government mechanisms to distribute that through different communities like our ISACs and other portals that people have access to. But I never knew really how, if people got it, if they consumed it, if they did anything about it. It was just kind of like shooting it out into the universe and hoping people find it.
Mm.
And so what I've learned now being on the private sector side is that not a lot of people are aware of this information actually, or not enough people. And so if you're thinking about an awareness program in your own company, part of that awareness program needs to have what I would call a threat intelligence component that is just actively looking at government sources that are being posted and synthesizing that down so that people in your company and your executives have an awareness of this threat information. They can start asking questions. And just that point I made about the cybersecurity law in China. If you have a product vendor that has like an R&D center or has teams that are doing source code development or something, and they're based in China for economic reasons because it's cheaper or the workforce there is more skilled or whatever the reason is,
Mm.
you really need to be asking questions of that vendor about the protection or or how much of that code or how many of those assets are being put into my process control environment. And then that could, if your risks are high, this is a risk management decision. If that's too risky for you, then how do you guard against it? Do you actually add more cybersecurity controls? Do you contractually, with that vendor, limit the ability for them to put those kind of products and services into your environment? There's a lot of things you can do, but you can't do anything unless you're asking the questions and are aware of the problem. So that's just one of those areas where, like I said, there's a lot of information out there. It's unfortunate that people aren't accessing it and aren't utilizing it and applying it to their business like they should.
So this sort of ties in, I guess, to the people, process, technology piece that we sort of touched upon earlier. And so, say for example, then I'm out there at the moment. I've got a couple of guys or girls in my OT security setup. I'm working towards a better picture, but I was maybe unaware of the assuming that China is already in our systems is the way to think about things. So let's assume they're already in. What are the sort of, I guess, is there sort of one or two things we can tackle first of all that will harden us against an attack if there was to leverage?
Yeah. I think there are. I think the first thing, and this is kind of born from a methodology that was developed at the national laboratories called cyber informed engineering. But I don't think it's unique to it's. This is kind of in some ways common sense if you really boil it down. If you have a lot, depending on the size of your organization, there are certain processes or functions that are more critical than others on your production or process line. And so there are some, so we'll call them critical functions for to use just a kind of a term here. There are some functions that are so critical that if you were to lose them, it would have a significant impact on your business or on your ability to perform your service, like deliver power or deliver water. And there are some functions that are not as serious. You could lose them; they could go offline for days, and it would maybe create inefficiencies, but you wouldn't go down in your ability to do your thing. Okay. And so the first thing that people should do is really do an evaluation of what are their critical functions. What are the things the processes they cannot lose? Maybe it's a facility. Maybe it's a specific production line within a facility. And so it could be that narrow. It could be literally a station in a production facility that is so critical that everything runs through that thing. I'm being very general here. And so that's the first thing, is to prioritize your functions so that you know the things that matter the most. Because I don't think the goal anymore is to try to secure everything equally. I think the thing now is, again, survive an attack. You don't want to be, if you're going to get in a skiing accident, you don't want to break the vertebrae in your neck that controls all the nerves to your heart, right? You'd rather like break an arm or something, right? So you want to protect the part of you want to protect the part your head with a helmet and all these other. You want to take measures to protect the things that you cannot lose, right? That's like in a sports analogy or something. In a business line analogy, it's like that critical function is like the nerve to my heart. I got to protect it. I got to build structures around it to make sure that it is hardened. And so then you can go in and evaluate and assess your digital dependencies. How many connections are into that environment? Do I have functions in that environment that I don't need? They're in there because the vendor put them in there. They were good. They sounded great at the time, but I don't need them or I don't use them. So can you eliminate functionality that is unnecessary? For digital functionality and connectivity that you have to have, what are you doing to monitor it? Who has access to it? Then you start to apply the security control questions there. And I think if that mindset is built around critical functions, then you have done a significant amount to protect yourself against a really bad day, because you can kind of assure yourself first that you even know what your environment looks like. So you know what your problem is. And then you can take steps to address it. I think if you don't do that process of even finding out which critical functions are, you're really probably ignorant of the risks that are in that environment.
And so this might vary, quite wildly depending on the environment. But you've got the nerve center there, or the critical system that you
Yeah.
absolutely can't lose. Is there, in your view, like a weight towards people or process or technology as a way of tackling that? Is it evenly split? What's sort of in the world at the minute?
Yeah. Well, I think this is where, kind of the shameless plug for my company is that you can hire third party consultants that come in and can help you perform that job. Like
Got it. Yeah.
everybody, it's so difficult. I mean, and it's not just like shameless plug. It's kind of like, if you step back and think about it, everybody in these in these operational environments has a job. They have something to do every day to make sure that everything's working. And companies have driven their efficiencies down. There's not a lot of redundancy in that area, so everybody's busy doing something. And so asking them to do this in addition to everything they do as a day job is just asking too much. And so part of that is, let's get a company in there that specializes in this kind of analysis to come in, work with your engineers, your control system operators, and your security people to say, hey, we'll work with you so we understand your environment well enough that we can help make recommendations for you that you can implement. And I think that is probably the most efficient, effective way to do something like that. Because people, this is not just like come in and just ask random questions. It's a real methodology to be able to do this effectively and efficiently.
Yeah.
In terms of like people process technology, I think there's a trend that in OT security. This may not be popular with your audience because probably a lot of people work for OT security firms, but I don't believe that technology is the solution. Adding more technology that just gives you more things to look at. I mean, I've heard all the pitches. My technical solution will solve your problem.
Mm.
But, you know, I'm a little dubious about that because if you don't have solid processes backstopping that technology, if you don't have it properly configured and supported by people who are actively continuing to work with it every day to understand what they're looking at, if you're not doing those extra steps, and that's usually comes down into process and people, like adding people or hiring a third party managed security service provider to do that for you, or if you're not adding resources to it, then you're not really getting the benefit of the technology, if that makes
Mm.
sense. It's really like you break it down. The core issue is people and also an organizational resource a strategy backed by resources to support the process and the technology and even the people with training and awareness so that they can actually cover this down,
Mm.
to the future. So
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree on the OT front based on a lot of people I've spoken to in that space. That seems to be the fairly consistent message that there's no silver bullet out there that's going to take all your problems away. It's the same in what we do. We could have
yeah,
all the snazziest hardware, software, recruitment, this technology in the world, but if there's no one
yeah,
behind it that's going to operate it and join all the dots together, it falls
yeah.
over. Despite what you say about AI, I'd like to think there's a human being at the center of the all.
Yeah.
So, do you come across people that maybe, I don't know, are looking at getting services such as yourself in, or maybe looking at new technologies, but the budget doesn't seem to be there as much for the OT security space?
Oh yeah. When I left the government, I was at least aware enough to know that I didn't know a lot about how the market worked and what were that's one of the reasons why I came to this company and wanted to jump into all the way to the design and construction side as opposed to even just working for a utility, because
Mm.
I wanted to understand the business of security and what do companies face and what are the questions and priorities they have because when you're in the government you're just kind of asking the question, well, why isn't everybody doing this? Why are people just spending the money to secure their systems? And there's always got to be a reason. And I think, kind of, this is generalities here. I mean, every company is different and every sector is different, but I think in general security is a cost center. It is it's not a place you're going to make money. And if you're in a utility, you make money by selling electricity or water, and the rates are fixed because of regulatory issues or because of politics or at the local or state level. So the rates don't generally change. You have only so much money you can charge for the power or the service you provide, and then you also have interest rates on capital projects that are going up and down and make things are getting more expensive to do. So your margins are not great, right? And so, or they're getting tighter. So where's the money going to come from for security, right? The government isn't providing it. It's got to come from the ratepayer if you're in a utility, or it's got to come from your business if you're in a critical manufacturing or some sector where you're just in the commercial sector. It's got to come from your profit margin. So everything's got to be justified and argued for at the highest level against all these other things that businesses have to concern themselves with. And so I think budgets for security always get a little, no, I mean, I shouldn't say always, but they tend to get really heavily scrutinized, and it's never enough to do everything you got to do, especially in an operational environment where, let's say, you've had no industrial security program for the last 30 years, and now you got to ramp up big time. Well,
Yeah.
you can't ramp up with, a huge investment. You got to do that over time. And so if you look at the kind of the threat is ramping up, well, we're aware of the threat, but now we're ramping up slowly too. The threat is outpacing the security in every sector, right? Even if you're aware of it, your investments are probably not going to be sufficient to cover your whole environment at the same level that the adversary is developing capabilities to target and hold that environment at risk.
Mm.
And so yeah, there's never enough money, and because of the way that the security programs are organized, it's usually kind of one of these bolt-on after the fact, hire a security firm or bring in a security monitoring service, or bring in something that I can add on to the existing industrial system and then work with that. And that's often, again, technology. So people are applying technology that has monitoring capabilities that may not be well configured for their environment. So then they're frustrated by their ability to learn from this technology that they just bought. Uh,
Mm.
and so, there's a lot of issues there. I personally believe, and again, this is why I'm at 1898 and Co. and Burns and McDonnell, and this it's a theory that we're having some success with, and I hope it continues. Is the best place to really address all of this is in the design phase of anything new. So,
Yeah.
and so it's not about bolting on technology. You don't even get to that point until you've gone through this entire design process and procurement process and early construction process where you may have engineered out through just asking the right questions and doing the line diagrams of control systems in the right way. You may have eliminated a lot of cyber risk just in the paper phase,
Mm.
right? So that by the time something starts to get built, you have well documented, understood. You understand your cyber risks pretty well because you've
Mhm.
designed them with them in mind, and that gives you very specific requirements for a cybersecurity program that you can then start to implement as the thing is built or it goes online.
Mm.
And so if you go to a OT security vendor, you have a very clear list of here, this is what I actually need, and I need it in this place, and I need it to do this thing. And that I think is way more cost effective for the cybersecurity program, and it's actually practically effective because
Mm.
you've got a pretty good understanding of what you're asking it to do.
So get a cyber person in the room from day one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean
Just
that
get them in the room, in the conversation,
That is
consideration,
that
awareness.
cyber-informed engineering methodology. And again, the Department of Energy is really leading this. There's a whole community of practice around this. There's an implementation guide that has been published where it's really just a guide that is trying to just at least formulate the right questions to ask at the design phase so that you can, so it's not just going and just ask cyber questions. They're like whole systems organization questions, right? It's how cyber permeates the system. I think, I could have said this earlier, but cyber has traditionally been considered by people as just the IT system, like the
Yeah.
computer and the connectivity and the internet. That's what people think of when they think of cyber. Really, you got to think of cyber as that entire communications and connectivity network ecosystem that is connected to anything that has a process, like a digital asset at the end of it, right? Computing power that's connected through all kinds of modalities. IP protocols, but not just the internet, satellite, private LTE networks or public LTE communications, wireless, anything that's communicating in and out of these systems is, in my view, cyber. Okay. And so it isn't just bringing in somebody who's well trained in IT cybersecurity. You've got to have somebody who has a systems view, like a much more systematic view of how this cyber ecosystem could not only enable the system to do great things, but can also make the system fail. So cyber is like a force in the universe, just like the weather and wind and earthquakes and all these other things people engineer around for safety and process functions. Cyber is something that has to be looked at in the same way. It's a way the system could fail. And so therefore it introduced risks. And that's what engineers do is they address risk through design. So if we can, that's part of that cultural mindset shift is to see cyber in that way.
Mm.
And that's a different way of looking at it than just thinking of it as like, well, that's your IT and CISO's, internet problem or something. That's simplifying it, but that's too many people think of it in just a very narrow way. But it is becoming just the foundation for how all OT systems work now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's touching on what you mentioned earlier around I work with a system every day, I know how to break it.
Mhm.
Okay, you might not be called a cyber OT engineer, for example, or an OT cyber engineer, but if
Yeah.
you know how to break it, you know how to maybe prevent that break. So it's having that mindset, which sort of ties into something else I wanted to touch on just before we
Yeah.
wrap up here. Do you see a skill shortage in the
Yeah.
OT security space?
Yeah, I do. I think that, so again, I may just be biased towards my own background because, like I said, I have degrees in philosophy, not in cybersecurity. But
Mm.
I think the skills shortages that we face are not in technology. Like it's not in the space of credentials and OT training. I
Mm.
think that in some ways our industry gets way too focused on over specialization of technical topics. Okay. I think the skill shortages are really so if knowledge, skills, and talents are things you're looking for in an individual, knowledge you can give by training. That's you can do that. And you need to train people on cyber and engineering, all these concepts. But the skills, I think, are things that are a little softer, like being a generalist, like having skills in communication. Like can you get somebody because the way these systems, everything I've been describing from an OT cybersecurity perspective, I think requires cross-functional teams. You need an engineer in the room, you need a security engineer in the room, you need a process control operator who knows this, who may not know how the black box works, but they know exactly which dials to push to make everything go back into alignment, right? So they know how to operate the system.
Mm.
They may not know the technology behind it, but they know how it works or they know how to use it. Engineers knows how it's all networked and configured. OT security people know the protocols and the beeps and squeaks of the system. I'll say, they know how
The
all
beeps
the
and squeaks.
yeah the protocols and the configurations are supposed to be done. Not any one person knows everything, but together they have all the issues covered.
Mm.
Well, the only way for that to work is if people in that environment are good communicators, they're curious, they ask questions. They don't just say, what can we do? They ask, why are we doing this? Why are we doing it? Like, why are we adding this process control? And what could be the downside impact of that thing going bad? And if we need it, then how do we secure it? There's a lot of those big questions that get asked and they're skeptical. And there's all that. So I think that those are skills that could be identified, they could be nurtured, and they can be trained. And it has nothing to do with your credentials. Because if you think about it, really go back to this China, and I didn't even mention Russia, but they're back too. The GRU has just been picked up again as being active in penetrating networks again. So if you look at nation state actors and you think they're trying to attack the system, they look at the attack surface as a system. They may be able to get in here and they want to get over here. So how do they traverse that system to access the control or the process that they want to be able to access and be able to have command and control through that network to wherever they are? Okay, that's in general the kill chain, right?
Mm.
If our security people are so siloed in their own narrow view of that system, then we're really just creating gaps and seams that can be taken advantage of by that adversary. So I would argue that why I'm saying we need more generalists and we need more cross-functional teams is that our security program needs to be systems view too.
Mm.
It needs to look at the whole system and the gaps and seams and the touch points and the access points and who has access to that and why and do we need that. Those questions need to be asked across the whole system, not just in a very specific narrow band of someone's expertise.
Mm.
So I'm a big believer that OT security in any organization should be cross-functional, and so you need skills across all that space. But in ours particular, yeah, you need the credentials. You need to understand. You need to go to the training. You need to understand how PLC works and all that stuff. But you also need to be able to have good communication skills and listening skills and healthy skepticism and be conversant in engineering principles and in process control principles and in the you need to be able to you're a cyber person who works at headquarters and you wear like khakis and polo shirts every day. You need to be able to walk into a facility and have a conversation with someone who wears Carhartt and has never been to headquarters. That
Yeah.
sounds, but that is actually just like an interpersonal skill too, right? Because like one thing I hear too often is the people in the process facility or whatever, they're like, I hate those IT guys or gals.
Yeah.
They don't understand they don't understand what we're doing. They don't listen to what I'm saying. And then the IT people say, I hate going in there because they're those people don't understand why I'm there. And they, like it comes down to just
Mm.
like interpersonal communication skills. And so organizations need to foster environments where those people get together, but also the
Yeah.
people should be trained and nurtured in their ability to work collaboratively with others. And I don't know if that sounds too soft, I guess, but I
No,
find
no.
it to be like very important in the skills shortage of the community we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it boils down to an awareness aspect of we're not so different in the roles we do. And I think what you mentioned there around the competitive challenge you might have with IT versus the people on the floor, say, that sort of one. Yeah, I spoke to one person, and sort of the factory floor folk were in the same room as the corporate IT people, and
Yeah.
they'd never met before. They'd never crossed paths. They'd never.
Yeah.
But they're working on the same system, just at different sides of it, and
Yeah.
it's bizarre. But then you
Yeah.
hear stories of, and I speak to people, for so many people that they are doing the cybersecurity elements of the
Yeah.
role. They're just not called cyber X, Y, or Z. So
Yeah.
it comes down to, oh, I didn't apply for that job because it said I needed X years experience. I needed a GXer. I needed this, that, the third thing. That's
Yeah.
not me. But then if you unpick it, that's exactly what they're doing. So I think
Yeah.
there's a bit of a miss out there sometimes of and often in these roles you may feel different, but I feel the job spec goes through a bit of transformation somewhere along the way, and we get
Yeah.
overexcited with the requirements, and we maybe
Yeah.
don't need everything on there. We probably could take somebody who's doing this near enough, and then,
Yeah.
like you say, that natural curiosity, that natural communication and talent will then shine through, and they will be a great fit for the role. But maybe that's
Yeah.
just a corner we need to turn slightly.
Yeah, no, I think it's like again, I used to make this mistake all the time when hiring people in my old jobs was you get a lot of folks that you get fixated on the knowledge part of a resume and the credentials
Mm.
and the background and all that background. But you know what, when you get them in the system, what you find out where they fall short is, well, maybe they don't work well with others, or maybe they have no experience outside of a very particular domain. Or, you know, there's now you start to look at features of like, can this person be adaptable?
Mm.
Okay, that is what we're looking for, is someone who has, yeah, this knowledge. They can walk in, they can converse about cybersecurity and operational technology, and they know what a PLC is or whatever, but can they adapt to an environment with people who are different than them to be able to have a conversation to get to an outcome? That's, I think, like that's more on the talent side of the knowledge, skills, talent kind of diverse of universe. But when you're hiring people, you really should be looking for indicators of that. Maybe that comes out in an interview or an internship, if you can get them as an internship for a while and see them in action a little bit. And are they curious? Do they
Mm.
want to learn? You know, are they kind of a little bit fearless in terms of the curiosity comes with the vulnerability of being able to ask a question you don't know the answer to. And that's something that, some people have that and some people don't. And I think that in our industry, OT security, I'll say, there's the technical people, particularly those who may be very, like well renowned because of their knowledge about the system, about technology, have totally mystified this whole topic and made it seem so complex and so hard and so complicated that people outside that system feel like, I can't talk to those people. I don't understand what they're saying. Well, guess where that now we're starting to shoot ourselves in the foot, because if you those other people who have turned you off because you've made the topic so complicated, those are your procurement people who are buying the systems that go into your environment that may not have any understanding of cyber risk. So they're buying technology or whole integrated systems that have cyber risk in them, but they never talk to anybody about it because they don't understand the problem. Or those are maybe your business strategy people, the money people who are coming up with the budgets. And if they have written you off as like, well, those guys, I don't want to talk to them because they've, they make me feel stupid. You're not going to have your input into the strategy for the company or the security plan. So to me, I think some of us need to take a step back, put our egos down, and try to like demystify this problem.
Mm.
Talk about the problem in real general basic terms and onboard all these other communities in our organizations into appreciating and seeing cyber as their problem too. And so I think that's a communication chat. That's communications. That's, like I said, more, being conversant and being a kind of outgoing and adaptable personality as opposed to just being a cyber expert.
Mm.
Because all that expertise, if it's just in your own head and you're not able to communicate it and you're not able to like engage and have interpersonal relationships, it's really kind of useless knowledge. It's not being applied in this cross-functional way that I think all organizations should be moving towards to address this problem.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree that communication is so vital in absolutely everything we do.
Yeah.
And so, just before we wrap up here, what are you excited about moving forward?
Well, I mean, people think that I'm a Debbie Downer, I guess, and because I'm always talking about threats and doomsday scenarios. I mean, my whole career has been around doomsday scenario type things,
Mm.
so I get that. but I am excited. I love change. I'm excited about innovation. So everything in the technology space, AI, Internet of Things, automation. I'm very excited about that. I mean, I want to make the world a better place for my kids and future grandkids too. And I think all of this is going to enable, the kind of things we need in our world that address climate change and, food shortages. And like, there's just the list goes on that like we're going to be able to make the world a better place through all of this innovation. So I'm very excited about that. But I'm not. I guess I've seen enough in my life and my career to be realistic about human nature. Some people have bad intentions. Nations go to war. You can't be, I think, ignorant. Somebody's got to look at the risks, and I guess that's me. Or people like me. So yeah, I get excited about all of this change and all of this, but I also look at the downside because again, if you don't take care of the downsides, then the upsides are you could lose all of that upside in really quick moments. I mean, history is full of these black swan events where everything looks great until something happens and it changes the whole thing, right? And so I'm always looking for those risks and how you can try to minimize those risks so that we can capitalize on all that upside that we're all so excited about. So yeah, I'm excited about that. And I also I guess in my shameless plug for government service, I hope that people, when they hear these threats, when they hear about the challenges we face, that they get motivated to try to get involved. I mean, I think that my time in government was some of the most rewarding of my life. And I think that, now, I mean, I'm doing something different with that knowledge to try to attack the problem from a different angle. But I think that if there's people listening to this now and they want to do something about that, I really encourage that they also get excited about service, service in some capacity. The government needs people who have all those skills that I just talked about, who have technical background, interpersonal skills, cross-functional team buildings and things like that, because the government is trying to do a very hard job. It's trying to defend the nation when it doesn't own 90% of the assets it's trying to protect, right? And it's trying to address groups like Volt Typhoon, but it needs skills and talents and abilities inside the government it doesn't have. So, I would say that if people are looking for career opportunities and like that they should also get excited about service. And that also can make them feel good. And then they can bring that knowledge back into the private sector at some point in their life too. And I think continue to improve companies from the perspective of the government as well. So that's the biggest cross-functional challenge we have is private-public partnership. And so if people can get themselves on both sides of that divide at some point in their career, then I think it also helps make policies and regulations and all the things that we deal with much more informed and more effective. So I would also be excited if more people took those career choices as well. So.
That's a good point. I think that's a whole podcast in itself with the government private sector sort of interchanging there. But thank you for sharing all that. I really enjoyed it. I've come away more informed, if not a bit terrified. But no, it's
well,
been
I
good.
Wouldn't be happy if you weren't. That's kind of what I told you. I'm the grim reaper of the OT security space. So
objective achieved, yeah. But Victor, that was fantastic. Thank you for running through all that. If people wanted to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I think we could. I'm on LinkedIn. I can provide you links to my LinkedIn page, or also 1898 and Co. has facing pages for me and the other teams and services we have, so we can provide links to that as well.
Awesome. That sounds good. Well, thank you again, and we'll catch up soon.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, man. Take care.